Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Can one person really make a difference to massive issues such as climate change, food insecurity, and animal rights? Advocates for more green diets believe so. According to an Oxford University study, global switch to diets that rely less on meat and more on fruits and vegetables could save up to 8 million lives by 2050, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3, and could also avoid climate-related damages of $1.5 trillion. But is a plant-based diet possible for everyone? Let's find out more about this story on today's show. Joining us for this is Travers, who's a dietitian joining us from London. Also joining us is Dr. Joanne Kong, who advocates for plant-based nutrition and is a lecturer on veganism and environmental sustainability at University of Richmond, Virginia. She joins us from Virginia. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Joanne Kong, let me begin with you. Now, you, of course, are an advocate for this type of a lifestyle. Why do you believe so strongly that this is the need of the hour?
This is so critical. My own personal background is that, like many people, I grew up not being aware where my food comes from. And when I was a college student, I learned about the tremendous suffering and violence suffered by animals in factory farms. So for me, it was an ethical decision that I could not contribute to those deaths and that pain. And it was something I really, like a lot of people, I had never thought about. So that was my initial reason for going to a plant-based diet. And then along the way, of course, I learned about the tremendous health benefits and how critical it is because animal agriculture is the most destructive industry on our planet today.
Expand upon that last bit there, how it is the most destructive industry today that we have to curb, we have to tackle.
This is something that a lot of people don't realize, in part because the way that animals are commodified and the whole industry, it's so distant from our awareness. We don't even know where factory farms are located, and we don't see the results and don't realize certain aspects of the animal agriculture industry, such as that animal agriculture commodification accounts for over 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, which of course contributes to global warming, climate change. The use of livestock has contributed to the huge amounts of deforestation, which are taking place all across the globe. Because of the raising of livestock, this is the #1 cause of species and habitat loss. We're even being described as existing now in the 6th mass extinction because of what we're doing to our fellow animals and the planet. And there's also pollution, ocean dead zones, and the massive inefficiency of using animals for food has diverted food crops from so much of the world's population. So it's become more a cause of world hunger.
Right. Dr. Joanne Kong, I want to talk about how we got to where we are today and whether it was always like this. But before that, I want to jump to Ms. Travers and talk to her about this shift, this important dietary shift that Dr. Kong is talking about. Now, many people would say that this is extreme, that this means that you do not have a balanced diet. Take us through that. What is important for a balanced diet? Which food groups are necessary to exist there? And have we moved towards finding alternatives to meat, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think that we have to realize that actually it's perfectly possible to get a balanced diet without eating meat. So the main food group that we get from meat is protein, but actually there are lots of plant-based proteins available. So beans, lentils, chickpeas, they provide a good source of protein for us. So it is perfectly possible to survive without meat. And although you mentioned having a kind of huge dietary shift towards plant-based diets, actually a lot of the world already eat a plant-based diet. So it's actually just, in some areas where this is becoming kind of a new thing.
Right. And you're talking about this becoming a new thing, diet becoming a fad in some places more than others. this is an essential point. Now, culture and tradition, of course, go hand in hand with the diets we have, with the food we eat. This shift, is it too radical? Can we expect it to actually happen in many parts of the world where meat is a central food for many of the recipes, many of the diets?
I think that we do have to embrace the fact that we are living in an age where we have to make changes. So, as your previous guest was just saying, we are putting pressure on our environment, and some things do have to change. The way that agriculture has shifted to feeding livestock rather than people is a real problem. It means that there is an issue of security. But as the world gets richer, lots of countries get richer, they feel like it is their right, in a way, to eat more meat. And in a way, why shouldn't they? But we have to recognize that if we don't change the way we eat now, actually the world is going to change, and it's going to be very detrimental to everybody's health.
Right. And in fact, it does seem like the world has changed quite a bit. Dr. Kong, now when we talk about the consumption of meat, the World Count reports that nearly 5 times in the second half of the 20th century, the amount eaten per person doubled. And now we're also talking about a stage where agricultural crops are fed to livestock more than humans. There is food insecurity because of that. How did we get to where we are today? How did we evolve to come to such a point where our intake has doubled and we're also becoming more food insecure?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. And oftentimes I'll look at the whole span of how human society developed. And critical to that was the rise of the Industrial Revolution, consumerism, certain aspects of technology and invention, such as refrigeration, by which meat and animal flesh could actually be kept for longer amounts of time. And I feel a lot that this so-called progress resulted in this idea of mass consumption. And unfortunately, along with that, what happened to us, speaking on a more personal kind of level, is that we became more and more distant from an awareness of where, number one, where our food is coming from. But to me, most importantly, as an ethical vegan, we lost that sense of connection with other animals. We began seeing them as objects, as just things, right? As consumer units. And for factory farms, it became a big for-profit business. So it's this re-identification of what other beings are that has led to this shift. And unfortunately, even though we do see the rise of veganism around the world, there are increasing movements towards more factory farms, especially in developing countries. And that's why I think it's so important. Probably the most important message I can get out to your listeners is that each of us has a choice. We can make a difference with what we choose to buy and the types of foods that we choose to nourish ourselves with.
Right. And that is the point that we all have a choice. Now, this is a question that many people will put forth. Many people who, of course, consume meat on a daily basis. Does one person's sacrifice of eating meat or one person's choice of not eating meat, will that make a difference?
Yes, it absolutely will. Lots of times we, in our society, we tend to feel powerless. We let other people, other governments make decisions and set agendas. But every single person is planting a seed. Every person is making a difference, not only for themselves, but for their families. And I'm here in the United States, and even in just the past 5 years, there's been such tremendous growth and interest in plant-based eating. So I'm optimistic that more and more people are going to realize that veganism affects so much, not only individual health, but the state of the planet and our sense of compassion and identity with our fellow animals.
And Dr. Kong, you bring up a wonderful point, the individual health that is related to this. Ms. Jo Travers, when we're talking about diet-related diseases on the rise, many non-communicable diseases on the rise, which are linked to our lifestyles, what role does meat and poultry have to play in all of this?
So we know that eating large amounts of meat, particularly processed meat products, have a risk factor for cancers of some kinds. So, for example, colon cancer and bowel cancer. We know that eating a lot of meat can be really bad for our health. The fat that we tend to get from animal products tends to be saturated fat. And saturated fat, when it is metabolized, causes inflammatory compounds. And
sorry, Ms. Travers, sorry to interject here, but just get a quick explanation on this. When you mean a lot of meat, what does that exactly imply? Now, that would vary from person to person, but what does a lot mean?
So the World Health Organization has identified that eating 50 grams of processed pork products a day or 50 grams of processed meat products can lead to an increased risk of things like developing cancers. So 50 grams may not be a lot for some people, but actually if you are living in the Western world, London, New York, or places in America and the UK particularly, that doesn't seem like quite a lot, but it does carry that increased risk. And as I was saying, when we have this saturated fat from meat, it causes inflammation in the body. And that in turn leads to increased risk of cancers, diabetes, and these non-communicable diseases that you were talking about.
Right. Now, Ms. Travers, while we hear about all these health risks, there are also diets, the keto diet, the protein diet, many of these diets which focus on these fats, which focus on protein. What can you tell us more about them? What is the science behind them? Now, people seem to be seeing results when it comes to weight loss, but are they truly healthy?
So I would argue that they are not truly healthy at all, because to get a healthy balanced diet, we need all sorts of things. And that includes whole grains and vegetables that contain carbohydrates, which are excluded from these diets. So things like beans and pulses and lentils, they are really good for us. They contain lots of fiber. That fiber feeds the bacteria that live in our gut, which has a symbiotic relationship with us. When we avoid these foods, it becomes a problem for our health long term. And while it might help with weight loss in the short term, actually it's not something that I would ever recommend for somebody to do for a long period of time.
Right. And that does, of course, resonate and resound in many ways, not doing something for a long period of time. Mr. Kong, when we were talking about this change, you also talked about consumerism and how it's evolved to cause people to consume more and more meat. Now, with any change, of course, it's important to take these macro factors, these economic factors at the back end into account. The push that the food industry will be given by this change, do you think it can deal with it by food lobbies, by powerful companies?
Yes, I think we need to look at how the economy drives everything. And it's worth noting that some of the top food conglomerates in the world, such as Tyson, they have seen the writing on the wall, and they are actually now producing alternatives to meat, plant-based products. And we're seeing this in the United States in even fast food chains starting to offer vegan options. So veganism is not just this short-term fad, it's really going mainstream. And you don't have to go to a specialty health food store or a special restaurant to get healthy, nutritious food. It's becoming more and more common, and more people are realizing the health benefits of making those consumer choices towards incorporating more plant foods in their diet.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kong, for joining us from Virginia. Ms. Jo Travers, while we're talking about all of this and veganism becoming mainstream, as Dr. Kong put it, is that the only way to go if you want to reduce your consumption of meat? What other options are out there? What other diets are out there for people who do want to be conscious of the environment, but don't exactly have what it takes to give up on meat completely?
So veganism is a kind of a way of life. It's a lifestyle. And we have this kind of more flexible term called plant-based, where we get most of what we eat from plants, but actually it leaves a little bit of flexibility in there, a flexitarian approach, and also like vegetarian diets, they allow for, eating things like eggs and milk and those kind of things, which are quite large staples in some countries in the world. So there are ways that you can make a difference without it being completely extreme. And actually, even just cutting down on meat several days in the week, you can make a huge difference to your health and to the environment. So, we can do it step by step. It's not black or white. There's lots of grey areas in between, and you can move gradually towards that at your own pace.
Right. And when we're talking about the damage that different types of meats, poultry causes, beef is seen to be one of the first on how many emissions they create, how detrimental it is to the environment. Take us through the reasons for that.
The environment is a very delicately balanced thing. And when you start to exploit the environment that we live in, things can happen. So soil is, exploited for its growth, and it's also then in turn put lots and lots of fertilizers on it in order to make it more fertile again. These things have runoffs into our rivers. We end up with this situation where we are just expecting more and more and more from the environment we're living in without really caring for it. And when most of our agriculture is going to feed livestock, that's an additional problem. So we have all of this land taken up, as Ms. Khan was saying, taken up, rainforests being cut down in order to provide land to grow soy to feed animals. And that is a real problem. It's a constant problem, actually.
Right. Of course, it is a constant. It's always evolving. On that point, I also want to introduce Ms. Louise Manning, who's a professor of agri-food and supply chain security. She joins us from the Royal Agricultural University in England. Thank you so much, Ms. Manning, for joining us, and welcome to this show. Now, when we're talking about this shift in lifestyle and diets towards more plant-based products, plant-based foods, what implications does this have when it comes to large-scale economy, trades, exporting, importing, especially of meat products?
I think if we were to look at Europe specifically, we have this huge challenge in terms of the amount of protein we can grow in Europe. So for our livestock production, so that means a lot of the protein is moved around the world. I think it's very important to think about livestock production in two ways. One is grazing livestock, where they're fed very little concentrated food. And the other type of livestock production, where there is much more intensive and they are given much more concentrated food rather than just eating grass or vegetation. So it's not as simple as good and bad in terms of livestock production. Around the world, there are many sustainable livestock systems. The grazing itself is supporting cultures that have been there for thousands of years. So we can't just put everything into one basket and say livestock production is bad.
Right. And as we're talking about innovation, talking about different ways of course, livestock production, what are some of the changes you've been witnessing, especially after we're seeing more concern about the environment, greater warnings about how livestock production impacts the environment adversely?
What we're seeing is, if we talked about grazed livestock, there's a lot of innovation going into technology in terms of us being able to be more efficient in grass-based livestock production. And that's really exciting, because it's bringing a lot of young people into the sector and people that aren't necessarily from a livestock background or even a farming background. So it's creating a whole new set of opportunities for agri-technology businesses. What we're also seeing is a drive in intensive production in the UK for the use of renewable energy. So if we have to heat buildings that livestock are in, there's much more of a drive for either manure being used to produce heat through anaerobic digestion, or to produce gas, or indeed using wood chip and renewable source of energy, and of course solar in terms of the electricity that's associated with it. So
right.
It's not just, it's far more complicated, and many of the controls are being put in place are focusing on sustainability.
Right. And as you're saying that this is, of course, a complex problem, not one solution might fix everything. I do want to put this fact to you that has been recorded by this Oxford study, which says that a global switch to diets that rely less on meat and more on fruit and vegetables could save up to 8 million lives by 2050. Take us through the food insecurity that we're seeing today and how that's linked to many of the problems about unsustainable livestock production that you were talking about.
Well, I would say that there is a drive to more sustainable livestock production right now. But if we're looking specifically at that report, what they are talking about is meat consumption in terms of health. And much of the meat that's being consumed around the world is not fresh, natural meat. It's highly processed meat. And some of the pictures that you're showing right now next to me are identifying that a lot of people will eat meat in terms of burgers, in terms of fast food. So not all meat is equivalent in terms of health. So what many of the studies are showing is that we have to eat meat that is of quality, and we have to be mindful when we eat meat. So it should be part of a balanced diet.
Right. Ms. Travers, that's an interesting point and a distinction that Ms. Manning put forth, that this is also a nuance that must be kept in mind. Processed meat, which is highly genetically modified, and meat that's grown organically. When you study people who come to you, ask for advice, when you study different diets, have you seen a considerable difference in those who consume organic meat and those who consume more processed meat?
I think the people that consume organic meat do tend to care a bit more about what they put into their bodies, so they will tend to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains as well. But actually, whether organic meat is better for us than non-organic meat is really, there's no evidence to say that. One clear thing that we can see, though, with organic meat is the fact that it's not routinely treated with antibiotics. And that is another issue completely, where we're seeing antibiotic resistance happening. Is possibly because a lot of the antibiotics used in the world are given prophylactically to livestock. So that it's another thing where growing meat for consumption is causing us problems.
Right. Ms. Manning, when we talk this not happening in the future, when we talk about more sustainable methods of livestock production, not giving them antibiotics, not giving them growth hormones, how will that match up to the population growth, the need for more food? Can we grow organic food and still sustain the population growth?
I think we have to look at what organic production is. For many small-scale farmers feeding their families right now, they cannot afford the inputs, the crop protection products, or indeed the nutrients to increase yield and thus produce in a more conventional way, as would be seen around the world. So some people are organic by choice. Others, they can't afford the inputs, so they're looking at that kind of system to grow food. Could we feed the world on organic production? Absolutely not. Should we be addressing food waste in our supply chains? Yes. Should we be addressing food waste in our homes? Absolutely. Should we be looking at our diets and seeing how we can be more healthy and having a good balance of plant-based foods as well as good quality meat? Yes, we should. And we have to look to the future. It is going to be a significant challenge. But I think every household, every person, businesses all have a part to play in trying to improve the food security around the world and also the resilience of our supply chains.
Right. Ms. Manning, just a quick last question to you, and I think this is essential to talk about, how you say we need to focus more on the food wastage we're seeing across the world. Of course, every individual needs to play their share, but what about businesses and large-scale stakeholders in this regard? What can they do to tackle this?
Again, as with all these things, there's no simple answer. If you look at food waste in developed countries and urban areas, most of the food waste is by the consumer or post-retail. If you look at a lot of the world where right now they are developing their agriculture, most of the food waste is around a lack of refrigeration, a lack of infrastructure to move food from where it's being grown to markets. And as we urbanize as a global community, that becomes even harder. So there are things that businesses can do to interaction with food and reduce waste.
Right. There's many things that need to be considered and many measures to be taken. Of course, as you're saying, it's a complex issue and different factors need to be considered. Thank you so much, Ms. Louise Manning, for joining us, and Ms. Jo Travers for joining us. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show, while we talk about eating food and producing food in a more sustainable way for the future. Now joining us for this discussion is Mr. Neil Steffens, who's a sociologist working on innovation in biology and has been tracking the development of cultured meat science. He joins us from London. Also joining us today is Qasim Tareen, who is the co-founder of Taza Tareen, a sustainable poultry farm. He joins us from Islamabad. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Neil Steffens, let me start with you. Now, what you do, trying to develop cultured meat, is something very interesting and not something many people would be familiar to. Take us through what this exactly entails.
Yeah, absolutely. You're completely right. Cultured meat is a very novel and interesting technology. It's not something I personally make myself. I look at companies, universities that are trying to produce this new way of making something that is said to be meat. So basically what we're talking about here is people who make meat, instead of killing an animal, taking a small quantity of that animal's body, a cell, and then expanding those cells in a dish, in a vat, to produce muscle. So the techniques are from biomedicine. The idea of taking cells and growing cells in medicine has been around for some time, and applying that to food. The idea being that you can produce muscle, potentially in large quantities, potentially, but not yet, more cheaply than meat produced today, and potentially, so the vision goes, with a better environmental impact. So it's really, sometimes it's called lab-grown meat. It's meat grown in an artificial environment. Very new, very interesting, still early stage.
Right. And it is very interesting and engaging. But one of the things we were talking earlier about was the debate between organic food and that is highly processed. Now, you're talking about lab-grown meat. How healthy is that?
Well, at the moment, we don't really know exactly how healthy it is because there hasn't been enough to be produced to be tested in any way. This is still an early stage research and design process. At the same time, people who make it hope that it will either be as healthy as meat, depending on how healthy you think meat is, or possibly healthier than meat, because it could potentially be produced in environments where there aren't what they call zoonotic diseases. These are diseases that can transfer from animals to human through eating their bodies. And it could be meat that would be produced potentially without antibiotics, so the vision goes. And of course, the use of antibiotics in farm animals is part of the issue of these superbugs that we're seeing, bugs, viruses that are resistant to antibiotics, that are impacting on people's health beyond the food that they eat. But this is all premised on a technology that's still in development. This is all possibilities for the future that we should look to, be interested in, but there's an element of wait and see as well.
Right, definitely. It's a very exciting possibility for the future. Stay with me on that point. Mr. Tareen, when we're talking about food and especially poultry being pumped with antibiotics, being pumped with hormones, now this must be some reason why you move towards a sustainable poultry farm. Take us through your idea and exactly how it makes poultry more healthy.
You know, there is a requirement for protein in diets for all human beings. Now, how we get that protein, poultry was supposed to be one of the answers in Pakistan. It was touted as a cheap source of protein. Now, the thinking that our food needs to be cheap and it needs to just sort of fulfill these basic nutrient or basic sort of calorie indicators that's the concept that was used, or that was the thinking that was used in developing industrial poultry. So as soon as you industrialize a natural food chain or a natural food source, you're going to start running into all sorts of problems, which is what is happening, what has already happened in Pakistan and in a lot of other countries around the world where you have industrial poultry farming going on. And it had gotten to such a point where even on a personal level, when we were expecting our first child, the doctor told my wife that stop eating poultry. So there is a very real, present, and clear need to adapt more sustainable farming practices.
Right. Mr. Steve, when you're talking about this alternative for the future, this cultured meat, do you think that it can actually be a sustainable alternative to the meat and the products we're seeing in such large quantities today?
It's a big question. It's such a core question. Mass production and what is the real world implication of mass production in terms of the environmental impact. Certainly, it looks like if cultured meat systems work, that it would use less land. And then there's debates about what happens with that land. Will you rewild it, so introduce more traditional habitats? Will you use it for renewable energy, solar panels, things like that? Or would the land be used for something else which might be less beneficial for the environment? But a really key issue is how much energy you need to make cultured meat in this kind of way. So as I said, in research and design levels, people use small petri dishes to grow cells. If this is commercialized, it will be in much larger vats, much larger factories, and you probably need to heat these things up, or you need to control them, and it's going to use a lot of energy. And where does that energy come from? There's some really interesting research that shows you need to think about whether you're using fossil fuels, whether you're using carbon-based energy in producing cultured meat. If you're just heating up these vats by burning coal, then that's going to have a big energy impact. If you can move them over to a decarbonized system, then the environmental impact will be very different. But equally, just getting to that stage has, first of all, decarbonizing energy needs a lot of research and design, and that's far beyond cultured meat alone. That's a challenge for, globally for every sector. But also working out how to make the cells grow in the way you want to, at the scale you need, is a real technical issue.
Right.
It's interesting you have
Mr. Stephens, sorry to object here, but I'm curious to know now when you're talking about developing this, and of course it's in the early stages here, but you mentioned a decarbonized process in order to produce this. How frustrating is it for you to see what's happening now when we're talking about making big changes, but these little supply processes, these little things that happen at the back end are not taken into consideration?
Yeah, well, sure. There's a big issue around political will, around public will to make change happen. And we've, of course, known about the climate catastrophe, the crisis for some time now. And politicians don't always move and act with the pace that we would want of them. What's going to change here? Now, a really interesting point about the whole idea of cultured meat is that those promoting it do not premise it on behavior change. This is not people doing something different with their lives, because you could get many of the benefits of cultured meat if people simply went vegan, for example, if people moved, or even if not completely vegan, just went much more towards eating plant-based foods. But the logic behind cultured meat is that actually in practice that will prove very difficult to get that change to happen, to get people to change their diets. Right. So instead of changing their diets, you let people eat exactly the same things, meat as they know it today, but you make it in a different way. You make it in a fundamentally different way, which is both its strength but also its weakness. Because for many people, this is strange, this is unnatural, and this challenges what they think meat is.
Right, but as you said, that this is something that's exciting and a possibility that's very exciting to see, especially when we're talking about a move towards a more sustainable and healthy lifestyle. Mr. Qasim Khan Tareen, now I want to put this question to you as well. When we're talking about sustainable farming, we're talking about growing of animals in a more sustainable manner. Is it enough to do, and will it be affordable for the masses? Now, this is, of course, a very niche concept in many areas of the world. Will it be able to sustain and feed millions of people?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think before the industrialization of agriculture, that's exactly how all of us ate. Was, we all had a neighborhood, small farmer, or lived close to farms, and all had, a lot more sort of practical knowledge about food and being able to cook food and being able to rear and keep animals. So, yes, absolutely. Right now, I mean, it's a novelty because it is, very few people do this. But, I mean, just simple supply and demand. I mean, the more people who start doing it, the cheaper it's going to get.
Right, but is that a realistic expectation to see people revert back to the old days and people living near farms and having, their neighborhood farmer provide meat to them?
Well, I mean, if you look at the way that, global trends are going at the moment, you definitely do have, especially in the prism of climate change, this requirement to revisit or go back to basics or go back to the drawing board, because somewhere down the road we did go very wrong, and I think that especially when it comes to food, the disconnection between ourselves and our sources of food is something that is very much a man-made challenge. So just the same way that we made this challenge, I think we should be able to also undo it.
Right. Mr. Stephens, now you, of course, are a sociologist as well, and I want to bring this question to you from this angle. Now, when innovations like these, especially for diets, are made and considered and developed, how are cultures and people's traditions taken into account, if at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Food culture is a real thing. What we eat plays into our identities. It also plays into our economies. A lot of people's jobs are dependent on the livestock sector at the moment. So shifts like this in a radical new method of production, of course, invoke hesitancy for some people. There are a number of surveys out there that have been done in multiple countries around the world that look at whether people would eat cultured meat, lab-grown meat. And the results vary depending on the methodology used, on a little bit on the part of the world where the survey is conducted. But generally you see clearly there are some people who are keen on this idea. They tend to be younger people, better educated people, more urban people and male. Equally, there's a whole set of people that are really concerned about this. I think from the perspective of the people who are producing cultured meat, as long as there's enough people who are prepared to try it and eat it initially. Remember, this is an early stage technology. They can't produce very much, really very little at the moment.
Right.
As long as there's enough people out there who are prepared to eat it when they can first produce it, and it looks like there are,
right,
then the vision goes that this will start to normalize it and people will want to eat it. I'm not sure it will be that simple, but that's the vision of the people who are producing it.
Right, and we're just going to have to wait and see how this unfolds. Mr. Khan, just a last question to you. Now, when we're talking about this new trend, we're talking about growing concern. Of course, it is amongst certain sectors of eating in a more sustainable way, but how do you think that awareness can extend? And how do you think you can do that as someone who is in the industry?
We always, our farms are open to people. We're very lucky that social media allows us to share a lot of information on a minute basis. So there's now a lot of information that is accessible. And people, I think, are a lot better now. They have the luxury of a lot more information to make better decisions. And we, like holding weekly farmers markets, just talking about food really, getting people more interested in cooking again, and finding out about where their food comes from. These are now trends that are set in motion, and we're just facilitating and just being open to people, and are always welcome to share information. And people, the response has been excellent.
And that's very heartening to hear. Right, and thank you so much, Mr. Qasim Khan, Tareen, for joining us and talking to us. We've unfortunately run out of time. Thank you, Mr. Neil Stephens, for talking to us. Of course, both of your guys' initiative paints a more optimistic picture for a more sustainable future, but we will have to wait and see and continue with more developing stories to see how these unfold. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.